So I've been asked to give around about a 15-minute introduction to kick off each of these three sessions. And today's really a sort of overview intro under the theme, why have I written this book? Why now? And what's the fundamental thesis? So let me try to do that in the next 15 or so minutes. Essentially, I think there are two basic reasons which motivated me to write this book, and they've been brewing in my thinking for many years. So I can answer the question of why now rather than years ago, and that's partly because I just had the time now to write it. But there are also other factors which I think have made the book, for me at least, timely. So these two reasons are, first, that surprisingly, there are still very few Christian accounts of democracy out there, at least in the English language, and at least addressed to political systems like the UK. There's an abundance in the USA. I have shelves full of books on this question posed to the American situation, but almost none addressed to the UK situation or similar parliamentary democracies. And let me say at the beginning that by democracy, I specifically mean institutions and processes by which citizens contribute to the choosing of office holders and the actions of government. So I do not use the term democracy for politics generally, although it is often used in that very general and loose way. Certainly, I've observed in Britain a very significant increase in Christian involvement in democratic politics over the last 30 or so years, both by individual engagement and by participation in Christian organizations, in secular parties, movements, campaigning groups, and so forth. I mean, really a sea change in the volume and level and seriousness of Christian involvement in politics. At the same time, there has been a flourishing of the subdiscipline of what's called political theology. And that has produced many theologies of politics in general, numerous publications, theological publications on all kinds of specific political issues, whether poverty, family, or climate change, many critiques of the state, and alongside that, a kind of industry of social scientific analyses of the place of religion in politics. Yet even now, there are still few integrated, constructive theological accounts of democracy as such, or of democratic institutions and processes. And in my view, and this is what I argue in the book, to produce such an account, we need in the first instance a proper account of the state, or the term I prefer to use, the political community, which includes the state and the people. So you could put it this way, that democracy should really be used adjectively, as when we speak of a democratic state, rather than as a noun, as a democracy, part of a political system, not the whole. And so this book is one attempt to help fill that gap for those who live under democratic systems like Britain's. So obviously it needs to be adapted and corrected and fleshed out in other British-style democracies. I'm keen to know what your perceptions are. That's the first reason, the lack of accounts of democracy. The second reason is, again, about the last 30 years, the rise of two powerful movements, kind of amounting to a sort of pincer movement that shaped the context of Christian political engagement, both of which I think are seriously deficient. One is the rise of an increasingly aggressive form of secularism that seeks to keep faith out of the public square and confined in the private realm of personal life or behind the walls of a religious building, on the assumption that faith is inherently divisive and destructive, whereas secularism is essentially unitive. Second is the growth of a new form of Christendom or Christian nation thinking, which seeks to retain, or where it's absent, attain a privileged public standing for Christianity in the state in order to shore up what is perceived as the fragile foundations of democracy and perhaps of society generally. And so really the book's an attempt to define a constructive middle way between these two positions. And I'm going to say more about both of those two positions in the next session. And let me add here that under the broader heading of Christendom or Christian nation thinking, one might include the various newer forms of Christianized populism that are appearing in a number of places around the world. I have some things to say about that. I won't say them now, but it's quite likely that that will come up in discussion. So that's the first question, why this book and why now? The second question I wanted to address is there a Christian rationale for democracy? I mean, if you've read the book, you'll have heard my full story on that. But for those who haven't, let me just give you a very quick roundup of what I'm trying to do in that part of the book. So for much of its history, as many of you will know, Christianity did not support democracy, or perhaps to put it more precisely, could not even imagine it as a possibility for their societies. There were a few exceptions, but they are really quite few until the Reformation. Yet today, the great majority of leading Christian voices, and I must say here, I'm thinking primarily of Catholicism and Protestantism. Orthodoxy requires a different story, which I'm not competent to tell. Some of you may want to contribute on that. The great majority of leading Christian thinkers and representative institutions in those two Christian traditions support democracy. So this is another sea change, a really sort of epochal sea change in Christian political thinking and engagement. And this has occurred in the last 100 years, 200 years, something like that. It's really quite a recent shift. And so what the book tries to do is not to tell that entire story, but to offer a sketch of what I think are the key arguments that have emerged over the last century or two to bring that change about. Though the book does allude to earlier sources, and as I point out in chapters 2 and 3, 1, 2, and 3, the roots of those Christian democratic arguments go right back to the Middle Ages and the Reformation and the early modern period. Indeed, arguably, those sources themselves refer back to the Bible for those intimations of support for democracy. Although you cannot say that the Bible teaches democracy. It's not that kind of a book. So these arguments, and I identify three fundamental arguments that have, I think, have been formative in leading the modern church to support democracy, are these. So there are some that are called consent theories, theories of popular consent, which argue that even though the authority of government ultimately derives from God, along the lines of Romans 13 or much of the Old Testament, nonetheless, the people's will, the people's consent is actually required in order to give legitimacy to a ruler who occupies or exercises that authority. These actually predate modern social contract and consent theories. And the story can be told of how modern consent theories, in fact, originated out of these earlier Christian conceptions. Second category of theory that I identify, I've called defensive theories. And here, the leading theological motif is the doctrine of sin, not just personal sin, but structural sin. The argument is that the people's role in electing and holding governments to account is necessary to shield them from sinful government abuses. So it's a negative understanding of democracy rather than a positive one, but very, very pervasive. And the leading modern thinker who represents that defensive theory is Reinhold Niebuhr, a mid-20th century American thinker. And the third category of arguments, which brings us most up to date, I've called participatory theories. And here the argument is not about rights, a right to consent, nor is it about defending people against dangers. It's about affirming people's positive capacities. So this argument holds that the people, indeed every person potentially, has an equal God-given capacity to contribute to the search for justice and the realization of the common good, which then leads to arguments for democratic rights, democratic opportunities for participation, and so forth. So those are three broad arguments that have crystallized, I think. They're not always distinguished very clearly in many accounts of democracy by Christians, but they seem to me to be very important systematic claims that are driving these arguments. And I think all of them are persuasive, and they complement each other in interesting ways. And so together they make up a really quite a powerful theological rationale for affirming democratic institutions and processes, not as the exclusive or even the mandatory Christian form of government, but at least as a highly desirable aspiration of Christian politics today, that Christian participants, wherever they are, ought to hold as a horizon to work towards, however limited the capacities are in a particular context, to move in that direction. So that's my broad summary of the rationale for democracy, Christian rationale. Of course, it's not universally shared across the church. And as recent events have shown in countries like the USA, Hungary, Poland, Brazil, many Christians on the ground either do not understand those arguments or reject them or have left them behind, which is a deeply troubling situation. So briefly, thirdly, if there's a rationale for democracy, what kind of democracy should Christians support? So I think we need to avoid the idea that the task of a political theologian or the church is simply to go away and do their biblical and theological homework and come out, spring the rabbit out of the hat and say, it's all good. We're all in favor of democracy, get to it. No, we have to be more discriminating and discerning than that. There is a particular kind of democracy that emerges out of this rationale and out of the broader tradition of Christian political thought. And by the way, a footnote there, justifications of democracy have come right at the end of 2,000 years of Christian political thought and cannot be divorced from that, indeed presuppose everything that went before. And that's implicit in what I'm now going to say in this third section and spelled out in a bit more detail in the book. So I suggest that the name we should give for the kind of democracy that Christians should support is constitutional democracy. It's not a unique term, it's not a theological term, it's widely understood among political scientists and legal thinkers. And it is essentially a system in which the people's voice is essential and indispensable, so not optional, and that it's given structured channels to express itself via systems of representation, voting, and many other avenues of popular participation. So that's the first thing. It's a system in which the people's voice is given organized and structured channels to express itself as an indispensable part of the political system. But secondly, it's a system in which that voice, the popular voice, the will of the people, and all other organs of the system operate within a framework of robust constitutional principles and restraints that are conducive to justice and the common good. That's a bit of a mouthful. It's all spelled out in chapter, 2 or 3. So democracy then, this is why I said democracy is not the name for the whole of the system. It's the name for part of the system. It's the name for the popular component of what should be a much broader, more complex, articulated constitutional framework with many actors, many agents, many institutions. We have the judiciary, we have the legislature. In federal systems, there are different tiers of political authority. There are local authorities. There are all sorts of other public organs. In countries like the UK, there is There are public sector institutions like the NHS and so forth. So there's an ensemble of institutions, including those that channel the popular voice, all framed within clear and robust constitutional principles and fundamentally committed to the rule of law, which I would argue is the baseline of Christian political thought. And in the absence of the rule of law, there is little point yet in trying to lobby hard for democratic structures, because they will simply be fragile and easily exploitable. That was a side note, bearing in mind that we're not here only talking about so-called stable Western democracies. So I'd said there that a constitutional democracy exists in order to promote justice and the common good. So these are the terms for what I take to be the central purpose of the state under God. That's compressing a lot of thinking. You may want to come back on that and on anything. So those are the terms that I've identified because they have been central in respectively the Protestant and the Catholic traditions. And both are powerful terms, justice and the common good, rich, powerful, multi-layered terms that need careful unpacking. They are attempts to capture what you might call the raison d'etre of the state, or its reason for existing, or to put it more technically, the telos, the inherent purpose of the political community. Now, that very idea that the political community has a telos, has an inherent goal and intention that is intrinsic to it, is itself a very controversial statement today, and we may want to discuss its implications. So democracy then derives, I want to suggest, it derives its justification from that purpose, from that raison d'etre. It does not derive its ultimate purpose from the bare will of autonomous individuals, as if the people collectively and autonomously could define the content and meaning of justice and the common good out of their own subjective wills. So therefore, I don't find it helpful at all to use the term popular sovereignty, which I think is a very misleading term. And I would say that even where majority will prevails, as it often must do in specific decision points in the system, there should be robust protections for minorities. So quickly to wrap this up, I use this term constitutional democracy rather than the more familiar term liberal democracy, even though there's a large overlap of principle and practice. So I'm not pitting constitutional democracy against liberal democracy as two completely different systems. Rather, I think the word constitutional democracy better articulates what is distinctive in a Christian perspective on democracy. And by using that term, it also avoids the implication that Christians need to affirm the philosophy of secular liberalism, which is widely taken to be the underpinning of liberal democratic institutions, but which isn't, in my view, and shouldn't be, and needn't be. All right, there's more to say, but let me stop there because I've already gone over 15 minutes. So let's move on to the next section. Thanks, Bruce.
Lisa, it's over to you. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Dr. Chaplin. It's a privilege to respond to the first actually part of your book on defining and defining democracy. Yes, defending and defining democracy. So in the interest of time, I actually wrote my response, so I will read it. Yes. I first encountered your work, Doctor, in graduate school at the Full University Amsterdam. And my interest, like many of you who are here with us, was how as Christians can we conduct ourselves in the public sphere. So that was my first actually interest in your work, especially those involved in influencing policy advocacy. So I think that will be more on the third session of this. So we hope that you can join us for all three sessions. As Christians, we ought to respect other comprehensive beliefs, but at the same time influence also policy based on our own Christian worldviews. So this is, for me, the Christian imperative, and I think for most also who are in policy advocacy, or also Christians have this view. But how do we do this? It's a challenge. So writing a paper on Christian imperative in the public sphere, I turn to works of both secular and Christian thinkers on ethics of citizenship. So while Habermas' work on religion in the public sphere was very helpful in this idea of reflexive thinking, which you also included in your book, to respect each other in the public sphere, it was your article, Rejecting Neutrality, Respecting Diversity, Liberal Pluralism to Christian Pluralism, which helped me to respect diversity, but at the same time influence policy in the public sphere. So I think you said you mentioned these two contrasting pluralisms. A second our webinar, but I'll just say a little about it briefly here in the response. I hope I didn't preempt anything, but you said that an authentic Christian pluralism is where Christians can respect diversity while at the same time eschewing relativism. It's is inseparable from a Christian account of the nature and normative purpose of the state, which is to promote public good. And that was what you were, of course, explaining earlier. So public justice for neo-Calvinists, but maybe some Catholics are joining us here, common weal or good for Catholics. And protect diversity, of course. In contrast to liberal pluralism, which gives primacy to individual freedom and bases this autonomy on secular term. But what I found really very helpful with that article is that you also argue there that at the same time, we respect these different comprehensive beliefs. It is imperative for us to also influence the kind of political order that will be shaped. So I think in your book, Faith and Democracy, you expound on this. And I think we cannot underscore enough the relevance of your book with the resurgence of religion, as you mentioned today, rise of anti-democratic forces, and of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, how can we negotiate the rising tensions between obligations of citizenship, respecting different views in the public sphere, and demands of our faith on issues such as vaccines and face-to-face gatherings, including worship. So, but more importantly, I believe the Christian account of constitutional democracy that you gave, a Christian democratic pluralism, which argues that the nature and normative purpose of the state is to promote public justice, addresses what Charles Taylor identifies as the main conflict in today, right? Our search for meaning, which stems from the issue about sources of morality. So what Taylor means is that underneath the agreement on moral standards, justice, equality, freedom, in our modern society, there is uncertainty and division concerning constitutive goods. What constitutes justice? What constitutes equality and freedom? And hence, what are the moral sources for this? So when you said to know why democracy is important and what kind we should strive for, we first have to grasp why political orders exist at all. I believe you addressed this lack of moral sources. You pointed out that also that Oliver Donovan said Christian political theology. We're saying about the rise also and the progress, which is a good thing. Christian political theology can still speak to the rational and discipline of governing institutions in words that are otherwise missing from public debate. So we say we have faith in democracy, but you ask us to reflect on what kind of democracy. You explain that a democracy that is based on liberal pluralism gives primacy to individual freedom, deriving other political principles such as justice, rights, or community from it. And secular liberalism is liberalism which emphasizes individual freedom, which is based on the moral and spiritual autonomy of human beings. So liberal pluralism, to be to be clear, is therefore not neutral, but gives primacy to individual freedom and bases this autonomy on secular terms. So you contrast this with a democracy based on Christian democratic liberalism that gives the normative purpose of the state of promoting the public good. So, but of course, still looking after autonomy. But autonomy is protected and safeguarded, but it is not one of but it's only one of the shared liberal purposes. It is only one among many other possible modes of existence in liberal societies. In this constitutional democracy, what kind of democracy we pursue has consequences, I believe, and secular liberalism valorizes choice, while Christian democratic liberalism valorizes public justice and protection of diversity. I think that was, you underscored that at the last part, especially of the introduction. For example, I give an example. A state that valorizes choice will allow expansion of euthanasia and assisted suicide beyond medical reasons for seniors who feel their life is completed based on the right of the individual to die with dignity. While before, the individual's consent was just one of the requirements in a strict criteria for euthanasia and assisted suicide. This has now become the rationale for it. Individual freedom. So we say we have faith in democracy and its ideals, justice, equality, freedom. But these high standards need a strong source, not based on the moral and spiritual autonomy of human beings, as you were mentioning. And I believe that Christian democratic liberalism that you offer, constitutional democracy, gives that strong source. This teleological way of thinking, you pointed out, is not uniquely Christian or religious in approach. Of course, you have Aristotle, and just taken up by Thomas Aquinas, Christianized Aristotle, saying that the whole world was with moral purposes rooted in divine creation. Secular and religious, I think other Christian people can also consider this way of thinking. Human flourishing would be advanced insofar as humans and their institutions assign themselves with these purposes. So Charles Taylor here believes, and I agree with him, that bringing in the debate about sources of moral standards is important. And I believe that your book, especially the first chapter, Defining and Defending Democracy, contributed to this debate. So it's a pleasure again, Dr. Chaplin. Thank you to respond to you.